live in a strange time. Extraordinary events keep happening that undermine the stability of our world. Suicide bombs, waves of refugees, Donald Trump. In 1975, New York City was on the verge of collapse. For 30 years, the politicians who ran the city had borrowed more and more money from the banks to pay for its growing services and welfare. But in the early 70s, the middle classes fled from the city, and the taxes they paid disappeared with them. So the banks lent the city even more. But then they began to get worried about the size of the growing debt, and whether the city would ever be able to pay it back. And then one day in 1975, the banks just stopped. What happened that day in New York marked a radical shift in power. The banks insisted that in order to protect their loans, they should be allowed to take control of the city. The city appealed to the president, but he refused to help. So a new committee was set up to manage the city's finances. Out of 9 members, 8 of them were bankers. It was the start of an extraordinary experiment, where the financial institutions took power away from the politicians and started to run society themselves. The city had no other option. The bankers enforced what was called austerity on the city, insisting that thousands of teachers, policemen and firemen were sacked. This was a new kind of politics. The old politicians believed that crises were solved through negotiations and deals. The bankers had a completely different view. They were just the representatives of something that couldn't be negotiated with, the logic of the market. To them, there was no alternative to this system. It should run society.
Just by shifting paper around, these slobs can make $60–65 million in a single transaction. That would take care of all of the layoffs in the city. So it's reckless, it's cruel, and it's a disgrace.
But the extraordinary thing was, no one opposed the bankers. The radicals and the left-wingers, who 10 years before had dreamt of changing America through revolution, did nothing. They had retreated and were living in the abandoned buildings in Manhattan. The singer Patti Smith later described the mood of disillusion that had come over them. "I could not identify with the political movements any longer," she said. "All the manic activity in the streets. In trying to join them, I felt overwhelmed by yet another form of bureaucracy." What she was describing was the rise of a new, powerful individualism that could not fit with the idea of collective political action. Instead, Patti Smith and many others became a new kind of individual radical, who watched the decaying city with a cool detachment. They didn't try and change it, they just experienced it.
Look at that, isn't that cool?
Instead, radicals across America turned to art and music as a means of expressing their criticism of society. They believed that instead of trying to change the world outside, the new radicalism should try and change what was inside people's heads. And the way to do this was through self-expression, not collective action. But some of the left saw that something else was really going on. That by detaching themselves and retreating into an ironic coolness, a whole generation were beginning to lose touch with the reality of power. One of them wrote at that time, "It was the mood of the era, and the revolution was deferred indefinitely. And while we were dozing, the money crept in."
What's your date of birth, Larry?
But one of the people who did understand how to use this new power was Donald Trump. Trump realized that there was now no future in building housing for ordinary people because all the government grants had gone. But he saw that there were other ways to get vast amounts of money out of the state. Trump started to buy up derelict buildings in New York, and he announced that he was going to transform them into luxury hotels and apartments. But in return, he negotiated the biggest tax break in New York's history, worth $160 million. The city had to agree because they were desperate. And the banks, seeing a new opportunity, also started to lend him money. And Donald Trump began to transform New York into a city for the rich, while he paid practically nothing. The original dream of the Soviet Union had been to create a glorious new world. A world where not only the society, but the people themselves would be transformed. They would become new and better kinds of human beings. But by the 1980s, it was clear that the dream had failed. The Soviet Union became instead a society where no one believed in anything or had any vision of the future.
А если у вас было желание, какое вы смотрели, вы выразите сейчас?
Чего?
Желание, если у вас есть, например, какое у вас было бы сейчас?
Чего?
Желание, мечта.
Мечта?
Да.
Ну, как вам сказать?
Я повторяю 10 раз и снова. Никто не знает, как же мне хуёво. И телевизор с потолка свисает. И как хуёво мне никто не знает. Все это до того подзаебало, что хочется опять начать сначала.
Those who ran the Soviet Union had believed that they could plan and manage a new kind of socialist society. But they had discovered that it was impossible to control and predict everything, and the plan had run out of control. By the middle of the 1980s, the banks were rising up and becoming ever more powerful in America. What had started 10 years before in New York, the idea that the financial system could run society, was spreading. But unlike older systems of power, it was mostly invisible. A writer called William Gibson tried to dramatize what was happening in a powerful, imaginative way in a series of novels. Gibson had noticed how the banks and the new corporations were beginning to link themselves together through computer systems. What they were creating was a series of giant networks of information that were invisible to ordinary people and to politicians. But those networks gave the corporations extraordinary new powers of control.
Good morning, Southwest Development. May I help you?
Gibson gave this new world a name. He called it cyberspace, and his novels described a future that was dangerous and frightening. Hackers could literally enter into cyberspace, and as they did, they travelled through systems that were so powerful that they could reach out and crush intruders by destroying their minds. In cyberspace, there were no laws and no politicians to protect you. just raw, brutal corporate power. They were the technological utopians who were rising up on the west coast of America. They turned Gibson's idea on its head. Instead of cyberspace being a frightening place dominated by powerful corporations, they reinvented it as the very opposite. A new, safe world where radical dreams could come true. 10 years before, faced by the complexity of real politics, the radicals had given up on the idea of changing the world. But now, the computer utopians saw in cyberspace an alternative reality, a place they could retreat to, away from the harsh right-wing politics that now dominated Reagan's America.
You know, politics today is a disease. That's a real addiction. Politics, 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 politics. Don't politic. Don't vote. These are old men's games. Impotent and senile old men that want to put you onto their old chess games of war and power.
20 years later, the new networks of machines seemed to offer a way to construct a real alternate reality. Not just one that was chemically induced, but a space that actually existed in a parallel dimension to the real world. And like with acid, cyberspace could be a place where you would be liberated from the old corrupt hierarchies of politics and power, and explore new ways of being. One of the leading exponents of this idea was called John Perry Barlow. In the 60s, he had written songs for the Grateful Dead and been part of the acid counterculture. Now, he organised what he called cyberthons, to try and bring the cyberspace movement together. Barlow then wrote a manifesto that he called a Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace. It was addressed to all politicians, telling them to keep out of this new world. It was going to be incredibly influential, because what Barlow did was give a powerful picture of the internet, not as a network controlled by giant corporations, but instead as a kind of magical, free place, an alternative to the old systems of power. It was a vision that would come to dominate the internet over the next 20 years. But two young hackers in New York thought that Barlow was describing a fantasy world, that his vision bore no relationship at all to what was really emerging online. They were cult figures on the early online scene, and their fans followed and recorded them. They called themselves Fiber Optic and Acid Freak. In a notorious public debate online, the two hackers attacked Barlow. The hackers broke into the TRW network, stole Barlow's credit history, and published it online. The hackers were demonstrating the growing power of finance, how the companies that ran the new systems of credit knew more and more about you, and increasingly used that information to control your destiny. And the system that was allowing this to happen were the new giant networks of information connected through computer servers. The hackers were questioning whether Barlow's utopian rhetoric about cyberspace might really be a convenient camouflage, hiding the emergence of a new and growing power that was way beyond politics. What was going to emerge instead was a new system that had nothing to do with politics. A system whose aim was not to try and change things, but rather to manage a post-political world. One of the first people to describe this dramatic change was a left-wing German political thinker called Ulrich Beck. Beck said that any politician who believed that they could take control of society and drive it forward to build a better future was now seen as dangerous. In the past, politicians might have been able to do this, but now they were faced with what he called a runaway world. where things were so complex and interconnected, and modern technologies so potentially dangerous, that it was impossible to predict the outcomes of anything you did. The catalogue of environmental disasters proved this. Politicians would have to give up any idea of trying to change the world. Instead, their new aim would be to try and predict the dangers in the future, and then find ways to avoid those risks. Although Beck came from the political left, the world he saw coming was deeply conservative. The picture he gave was of a political class reduced to trying to steer society into a dark and frightening future, constantly peering forward and trying to see the risks coming towards them. Their only aim, to avoid those risks and keep society stable. What was rising up in different ways was a new system that promised to keep the world stable. Its tentacles reached into every area of our lives. Finance promised that it could control the unpredictability of the free market, while individuals were more and more monitored to stabilize their physical and mental states. And increasingly, the intelligent agents online predicted what people would want in the future and how they would behave. But the biggest change was to politics. In a world where the overriding aim was now stability, politics became just part of a wider system of managing the world. The old idea of democratic politics, that it gave a voice to the weak against the powerful, was eroded. And a resentment began to quietly grow out on the edges of society. But the new system did have a dangerous flaw, because in the real world, not everything can be predicted by reading data from the past. And someone who was about to discover that to his own cost was Donald Trump. One day, a man called Jess Markham received a phone call. It was from Donald Trump, and Trump was desperate for help. Markham was a strange, mysterious figure. He had been a nuclear scientist in the 1950s and studied the effect of radiation from nuclear weapons on the human body. Then Markham had gone to Las Vegas and become obsessed by gambling. He had a photographic memory, and he used it to instantly process the data of the games as they were played. From that, he could predict the outcome. And he always won. The Las Vegas gangsters were fascinated by him. They called him the Automat.
Where are we going? Let's go. Go.
Donald Trump was one of the heroes of the age. But in reality, much of his success was a facade. The banks that had lent Trump millions had discovered that he could no longer pay the interest on the loans.
You're right.
Trump's empire was facing bankruptcy. His wife Ivana hated him because he was having an affair with Miss Hawaiian Tropic 1985. And then, a famous Japanese gambler called Akio Kashiwagi came to one of Trump's casinos and started to win millions of dollars in an extraordinary run of luck. Trump, who was desperate for money, panicked as day after day he watched millions being siphoned out of his casino. So he turned for help to Jess Markham. Markham came to Trump's casino in Atlantic City. He analysed all the data about the way that Kashiwagi had been playing. He then told Trump to suggest a particular high-stakes game that he knew the Japanese gambler could not resist. His model, Markham said, predicted that Kashiwagi had to lose. And after 5 agonizing days, he did. Kashiwagi lost $10 million, and he gave up. Donald Trump was elated. He thought he'd got his money back.
たり必ず殺してやるから待ってろ。
Before Kashiwagi could pay his debt, he was hacked to death in his kitchen by Yakuza gangsters. And Donald Trump didn't get his money. Trump's business went bankrupt, and he was forced to sell most of his buildings to the banks. And he married Miss Hawaiian Tropic. In the future, he would sell his name to other people to put on their buildings, and he himself would become a celebrity tycoon. People in Britain and America now began to turn away from politics. The effect of the Iraq War had been very powerful. Not only did millions of people feel that they had been lied to over the weapons of mass destruction, but there was a deeper feeling that whatever they did or said had no effect, that despite the mass protests and the fears and the warnings, the war had happened anyway. Liberals, radicals, and a whole new generation of young people retreated. They turned instead to another world that was free of this hypocrisy and the corruption of politics. They went into cyberspace. By now, cyberspace had become even more sophisticated and responsive to human interaction. The online world was full of algorithms that could analyze and predict human behavior. One of the early utopians of cyberspace, Jaron Lanier, warned of the implications of this. The agent's model of what you are interested in will always be a cartoon model, and in return, you will see a cartoon version of the world through the agent's eyes. And, he added, it will never be clear who they are working for, you or someone else. The version of cyberspace that was rising up seemed to be very much William Gibson's original vision. That behind the superficial freedoms of the web were a few giant corporations with opaque systems that controlled what people saw and shaped what they thought. And what was even more mysterious was how they made their decisions about what you should like and what should be hidden from you. But then, the other utopian vision of cyberspace re-emerged.
The issue is that certain individuals that are very wealthy have pretty much corrupted our political system, and this is like the heart of it. I mean, this is a Senate building. These people have been bought off, and they've basically corrupted our democracy, and it's literally killing people. I'm an Iraqi war vet. I went to Iraq in 2009 to see what happens firsthand when we let corruption rule our government and our democracy, and we're coming here today basically just to raise awareness.
What drove the Occupy movement was the original dream of the internet that people like John Perry Barlow had outlined in the early 1990s. Each person was an autonomous individual who expressed what they believed. But together, they became components in a network that organized itself through the feedback of information around the system. You could organize people without the exercise of power. The Occupy camps had become trapped in endless meetings, and it became clear that there was a terrible confusion at the heart of the movement. The radicals had believed that if they could create a new way of organising people, then a new society would emerge. But what they did not have was a picture of what that society would be like, a vision of the future. The truth was that their revolution was not about an idea. It was about how you manage things. After the failure of the revolutions, it was not just the radicals. No one in the West had any idea of how to change the world. At home, the politicians had given so much of their power away to finance and the ever-growing managerial bureaucracies that they, in effect, had become managers themselves. While abroad, all their adventures had failed, and their simplistic vision of the world had been exposed as dangerous and destructive. But in Russia, there was a group of men who had seen how this very lack of belief in politics and dark uncertainty about the future could work to their advantage. What they had done was turn politics into a strange theatre, where nobody knew what was true or what was fake any longer. They were called political technologists, and they were the key figures behind President Putin. They had kept him in power, unchallenged, for 15 years. Some of them had been dissidents back in the 1970s, and had been powerfully influenced by the science fiction writings of the Strugatsky brothers. 20 years later, when Russia fell apart after the end of communism, they rose up and took control of the media. And they used it to manipulate the electorate on a vast scale. For them, reality was just something that could be manipulated and shaped into anything you wanted it to be. But then a technologist emerged who went much further, and his ideas would become central to Putin's grip on power. He was called Vladislav Surkov. Surkov came originally from the theatre world, and those who have studied his career say that what he did was take avant-garde ideas from the theatre and bring them into the heart of politics. Surkov's aim was not just to manipulate people, but to go deeper and play with and undermine their very perception of the world, so they are never sure what is really happening. Surkov turned Russian politics into a bewildering, constantly changing piece of theatre. He used Kremlin money to sponsor all kinds of groups, from mass anti-fascist youth organisations to the very opposite, neo-Nazi skinheads, and liberal human rights groups who then attacked the government. Surkov even backed whole political parties that were opposed to President Putin. But the key thing was that Surkov then let it be known that this was what he was doing, which meant that no one was sure what was real or what was fake in modern Russia. As one journalist put it, it's a strategy of power that keeps any opposition constantly confused. A ceaseless shape-shifting that is unstoppable because it is indefinable. Meanwhile, real power was elsewhere, hidden away behind the stage, exercised without anyone seeing it. And then, the same thing seemed to start happening in the West. By now, it was becoming ever more clear that the system had deep flaws. Every month, there were new revelations of most of the bank's involvement in global corruption, of massive tax avoidance by all the major corporations, of the secret surveillance of everyone's emails by the National Security Agency. Yet no one was prosecuted, except for a few people at the lowest levels. And behind it all, the massive inequality kept on growing. Yet the structure of power remained the same. Nothing ever changed, because nothing could be allowed to destabilize the system. But then, the shape-shifting began.
Thank you very much. So nice. So amazing. So amazing. What? That's okay. I love you more, okay?
The campaign that Donald Trump ran was unlike anything before in politics. Nothing was fixed. What he said, who he attacked, and how he attacked them was constantly changing and shifting. Trump attacked his Republican rivals as being all part of a broken and corrupt system, a politics where everyone could be bought, using words that could have come from the Occupy movement.
You've also donated to several Democratic candidates, Hillary Clinton included, Nancy Pelosi. You explained away those donations, saying you did that to get business-related favors. And you said recently, quote, "When you give, they do whatever the hell you want them to do."
You better believe it.
So what specifically did they do?
If I ask them, if I need them, you know, most of the people on this stage I've given to, just so you understand, a lot of money. I will tell you that our system is broken. I give to many people. Before 2 months ago, I was a businessman. I give to everybody. When they call, I give. And you know what? When I need something from them, 2 years later, 3 years later, I call them. They are there for me. And that's a broken system.
But at the same time, Trump used the language of the extreme racist right in America, connecting with people's darkest fears, pushing them and bringing those fears out into the open.
Get the fuck out of here! Our country! Proud fucking American! Made in USA, bitch! Made in fucking USA! Don't fucking cook my burrito, bitch! Don't fucking make my tortilla, motherfucker! And build that fucking wall for me! Trump! I love Trump! Fuck you! I love my country! Yeah! I'll fuck like at least 10 of you up in one fucking city, you fucking pussy! Come on!
Many of the facts that Trump asserted were also completely untrue. But Trump didn't care. He and his audience knew that much of what he said bore little relationship to reality.
Thank you very much.
This meant that Trump defeated journalism, because the journalists' central belief was that their job was to expose lies and assert the truth.
Greatly appreciated.
With Trump, this became irrelevant. Not surprisingly, Vladimir Putin admired this.
Что вы думаете о Дональде Трампе?
Ну, он яркий очень человек, талантливый, без всяких сомнений. Но это не наше дело определять его достоинство, это дело избирателей в Соединенных Штатах. Но он абсолютный лидер, мы сегодня видим, президентской гонки. Он говорит о том, что хочет перейти к другому уровню отношений, более плотному, глубокому уровню отношений с Россией. Ну, разве мы можем это не приветствовать? Конечно, мы это приветствуем. Все, что касается внутриполитических вещей, его обороты речи, что он использует для повышения своей популярности, повторяю еще раз, это не наше дело оценивать эту его работу.
Спасибо.
The Liberals were outraged by Trump, but they expressed their anger in cyberspace, so it had no effect, because the algorithms made sure that they only spoke to people who already agreed with them. Instead, ironically, their waves of angry messages and tweets benefited the large corporations who ran the social media platforms. One online analyst put it simply: angry people click more. It meant that the radical fury that came like waves across the internet no longer had the power to change the world. Instead, it was becoming a fuel that was feeding the new systems of power and making them ever more powerful. But none of the Liberals could possibly imagine that Donald Trump could ever win the nomination. It was just a giant pantomime.
And then, of course, there's Donald Trump. Donald Trump has been saying that he will run for president as a Republican, which is surprising since I just assumed he was running as a joke. Donald Trump often appears on Fox, which is ironic because a fox often appears on Donald Trump's head. Donald Trump owns the Miss USA pageant, which is great for Republicans because it will streamline their search for a vice president. Donald Trump said recently he has a great relationship with the blacks, though unless the blacks are a family of white people, I bet he's mistaken.
But underneath the liberal disdain, both Donald Trump in America and Vladislav Surkov in Russia had realized the same thing, that the version of reality that politics presented was no longer believable, that the stories politicians told their people about the world had stopped making sense. And in the face of that, you could play with reality, constantly shifting and changing, and in the process further undermine and weaken the old forms of power.